I'm going to be talking about Iraq and why it's the country that best exemplifies world history from 1900 to the present. I think what makes Iraq particularly suitable as an answer to this question is, firstly, it's a really illustrative example of the brutality of the West towards the so called Third World, and secondly, Iraq actually becomes the focal point of the shift from the Cold War into the modern era of geopolitics in the liberal world order. European and American imperialism have impacted the world, the modern world, more than just about anything else, and I think Iraq has felt the effects of that in a particularly severe way. When the Ottoman Empire was carved up after World War I, the British took control of Iraq and imposed a monarchy, allowing them access to Iraq's considerable oil reserves. Now, surprising as it might sound, life under a British controlled puppet regime with them stealing your resources was not great, and Iraq, like many other countries in the Third World, had a brief period where they pushed back against this and attempted to assert control over their own country before that was brutally crushed by the West. So, in 1958, an officers' coup overthrew the monarchy and brought in Abdel Karim Qasim to power. And Qasim's government was not without its issues, but generally charted a more progressive course, allying with the Soviet Union, implementing land reform, and partially nationalizing the Iraq Petroleum Company, which was British owned. And none of that made the West particularly happy. So the US and UK found a useful partner against Qasim in the Ba'ath Party, which resented Qasim's alliance with the communists. When the Ba'ath launched a coup against him in 1963, the CIA provided the party with kill lists of communists and nationalist sympathizers. Thousands of these people were murdered by Baathists in the aftermath of the coup, and if you know anything about the history of Latin America or Southeast Asia or any number of other places, this will sound pretty familiar. Over the next few years, there would be a chain of coups that eventually culminated in Saddam Hussein's accession to power. For the United States, Saddam and the Ba'ath Party were useful allies that served first as a bulwark against communism and later as a counterbalance to Iran. With a newfound ally, the Americans showed their love of human rights and their loyalty to old allies, like the Kurds, by selling Saddam weapons, including eventually chemical weapons, that he used against Kurds, Iraqi Shias, and Iran. When the Cold War was winding down, the priorities shifted. It was the end of history, communism was no longer a threat, but the US still had bloated defense budgets and no desire to cut down on them. So this is where Iraq becomes ground zero for America's shift from opponent of the Soviet Union to undisputed global hegemon and policeman of the world. We gave Saddam tacit approval to invade Kuwait and immediately turned around and began prepping for war against him. As justification for the war, the American public wasn't propagandized to about the need to stop the spread of socialism or anything like that was used to justify a lot of these old wars, but instead we were told, we need to stand up for human rights. This was really the new framework for America's wars to come. We're not fighting for capitalism anymore. That's a done deal. There's no alternative. Nothing can challenge that. But sometimes we're still fighting for democracy. Now we're also fighting for human rights. So we see it manifested time and time again in these humanitarian interventions in a bunch of different places. And none of this is to say that the actors targeted by this line of attack are innocent or anything, but the focus is always applied selectively, and it's exactly what we saw with Saddam over the years. America enabled his worst atrocities when it was useful, and then began denouncing him as, Hitler 2.0 when they needed a new target. When the 2003 invasion of Iraq came around, America had found another justification for our forever wars. Human rights probably wasn't enough. You needed a threat of some kind, so now we're fighting terrorism too. And Iraq once again became one of the main focal points for this new paradigm. And if there wasn't a credible terror threat there to begin with, we certainly made sure there was one after we'd bombed the hell out of the country. So, between two wars and years of sanctions, America killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, set the country's infrastructure back decades, and plunged the country into chaos that it still hasn't escaped from, all to supposedly get rid of this monster that we helped make in the first place. And, as everyone knows, there was plenty of money to be made in war and occupation. So I think there's nothing more exemplary of modern history than the total destruction of a country over all these decades to just, secure more resources, more contracts, And Iraq has been at the front line of these global wars of the past 100 years, and it's still there now as the new battleground for the US and Iran. So it looks like the future is going to be a lot more of the same stuff that we've seen already.